Germans feel very put upon by the Treaty of Versailles because it essentially says that the Germans are guilty of starting the war.
What if an army was so reckless that even Hitler, a man who armed millions without blinking, hesitated to unleash them? What if the real danger wasn't the enemy, but the chaos he had created himself? In the final years of World War II, a force rose from the shadows, fearless, feral, and impossible to control. But who were the disturbing soldiers Hitler was afraid to give weapons to? Let's find out. In 1941, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, his massive invasion of the Soviet Union sent shockwaves across Europe. Millions of soldiers poured into the east. Cities fell overnight. The world watched in stunned silence, and in Madrid, Franco saw his moment. Spain was still battered from its own brutal civic war, barely able to stand. Franco didn't want another war. His country couldn't afford it. But defying Hitler outright? That was dangerous. Spain had survived because of German and Italian support. Now, Franco needed a way to pay the debt without pulling his country into the fire. His answer was simple but clever. The Blue Division, a force of volunteers who would fight for Hitler, but without Spain officially joining the war. No treaties, no formal alliances, just men and guns sent east under Germany's command. On paper, it was perfect. Franco could show loyalty to the Axis without risking the wrath of the Allies, and Hitler, desperate for anyone who could hold a rifle, quickly agreed. He needed bodies, fast. But nobody expected what happened next. In Spain, the response exploded overnight. Recruiting offices were swamped. Students, farmers, aristocrats, even entire military academies rushed to enlist. At the University of Madrid alone, 3,000 students dropped their books mid-lecture and ran to the recruiting lines. The cry roared through the streets. We pay the Russians a return visit. This wasn't just another campaign. For many Spaniards, it was personal revenge for the Spanish Civil War funded by the Soviets. And they brought a savage kind of energy with them. When the volunteers paraded through Madrid before leaving, the city roared like it was a festival. Their uniforms told the story of Spain's bitter past. The blue shirts of the Phalangists, the red berets of the Carlists, and the khaki pants of the Foreign Legion, and the black boots of the Guerrillas. A strange patchwork stitched together by anger, loyalty, and pride. By July 4th, 1941, just weeks after Hitler's tanks started rolling into the Soviet Union, the Blue Division was official. Estimates vary, but historian Stanley G. Payne notes that approximately 45,500 men joined the Blue Division. Other sources suggest numbers ranges from 50,000 to 70,000 due to rotations and replacements. They were cheered by roaring crowds, heading on trains for Germany. Their commander, General Agustin Munoz Grandes, didn't ride with them. He flew ahead in a sleek Lufthansa Condor, convinced he was leading Spain back into European glory. In Germany, the welcome was grand. The Spaniards stood in neat rows, arms raised in a fascist salute. When the German officers read the oath, absolute obedience to Hitler, the Spaniards shouted back without hesitation, "Yes, I swear." Cameras flashed, flags waved. On paper, it looked like a perfect alliance, but almost immediately the cracks began to show. Hitler had planned to throw them straight into the attack on Moscow, but at the last moment he changed his mind and sent them north towards Leningrad instead. No speeches, no explanations, just quiet orders. Those close to him understood why. The Blue Division didn't act like German soldiers. They didn't act like soldiers at all. German officers were horrified. Historian Gerald Kleinfeld later described them as an undisciplined bunch of macho men who refused to drill, march, salute, or wear military uniforms. Their first days in Russia weren't spent preparing for battle. They chased women, drank heavily, fought each other. and during an inspection paraded past senior officers with inflated condoms tied to their rifles. From a distance, Soviet scouts mistook it for experimental chemical gear. Field Marshal Hans von Klug didn't hide his disgust. "Are they soldiers?" he snapped, "or gypsies?" But Hitler wasn't disgusted, he was fascinated. He called them fearless fellows who scarcely take over equal to my best Germans. Their wildness made him uneasy, but it also impressed him. Still, a question hung in the air. Were they a weapon he could control, or a fire that could burn him? For now, he needed fighters more than discipline. He handed them rifles and sent them east. What followed was one of the most brutal marches of the war. From late August to early October 1941, the Blue Division trudged nearly 625 miles from Suwalki to Vitebsk, making it one of the longest sustained marches of World War II. Mud, sleet, freezing rain, they pushed through all of it, hauling 70 pounds of gear each. It became the longest sustained march of World War II. They didn't sing. They didn't celebrate. They just marched, one foot at a time, driven by pride and hatred of communism. When they reached the front, there was no waiting. Within 24 hours, they smashed Soviet defenses at Dubrovka. Their ferocity shocked even hardened German commanders. One joked, the Russians must have stolen their wives. No one doubted their courage, but bravery was only part of the story. Winter arrived fast, and it hit hard. Supplies collapsed. Temperatures plunged below freezing. Spanish soldiers scavenged stray cats for food. They stripped clothing from frozen corpses to stay alive. 700 fell to frostbite that first winter. As conditions worsened, they leaned heavily on German supplies, guns, boots, bread, while German troops starved beside them. Hitler needed their fight, but every day their chaos, their hunger, their drain on resources made him wonder how long before they broke something he couldn't fix. And then, against all odds, they did something that stunned the world and rewrote their reputation in blood. In January 1942, deep in the frozen wastelands near Lake Ilmen, hundreds of German soldiers were trapped behind Soviet lines. Getting them out seemed impossible. Rescue meant suicide. A task force of 370 men on skis, along with Latvian and Russian auxiliaries, undertook an 11-day mission in temperatures as low as negative 55 degrees Celsius to rescue encircled German troops near Lake Ilmen. They battled Soviet ski troops, dodged sniper fire, and crossed rivers of shattered ice. Only a few made it back unharmed. The rest were killed or wounded. It was a 95% casualty rate, but they pulled it off. They brought the Germans home. In that frozen hell, they proved they weren't just chaos, they were heroes. But the better they fought, the more dangerous they started to look. By February 1943, the Blue Division faced its biggest test yet, Krasny Bor. Positioned along the critical Moscow-Leningrad road, they found themselves surrounded, outnumbered 7-1 by the Red Army. They were hammered with artillery, then wave after wave of Soviet troops. The Spaniards didn't run. They fought street to street, trench to trench, turning the snow into a sea of blood. They held long enough to extend the Leningrad siege by another year, staggering achievement, but at a brutal cost. During the Battle of Krasny Bor in February 1943, the Blue Division suffered approximately 3,645 casualties, killed and wounded, and 300 missing, amounting to about 70 to 75% of the troops engaged in the battle. Back in Spain, Franco was watching, and he could see which way the war was heading. Allied victories in North Africa, American pressure mounting, threats of economic embargoes piling up. Spain couldn't afford to be seen standing next to a sinking ship. In October 1943, Franco recalled the Blue Division. The men who had left to the cheers of crowds returned in silence. Their triumph had faded into something closer to a funeral. But not everyone came home. More than 2,000 Spaniards refused to leave. Some joined the Waffen SS, others disappeared into the crumbling ruins of Germany's Eastern Front. By the end of the war, 250 Spaniards would make their last stand in Berlin, fighting outside the shattered Reich Chancellery as Soviet troops closed in, fighting until there was nothing left to fight for. But the chaos didn't end with them. By late 1944, Hitler's war was collapsing. The Red Army was rolling in from the east. Allied bombers were tearing German cities apart from the west. Hitler needed soldiers, and he didn't care where they came from. Boys barely old enough to hold a rifle, old men dragging the scars of the last World War, shopkeepers, farmers, madmen. He called them the Volkssturm, the People's Storm. While the Volkssturm was a massive mobilization of German civilians aged 16 to 60 in the final months of World War II, the actual number of individuals conscripted and armed is estimated to be around 1.5 million. Some were given rifles, others were handed shovels or kitchen knives. In Berlin alone, 50,000 were thrown into uniform in a single week. Most had never fired a shot. The result was chaos from the start. General Alfred Jodl warned Hitler this wasn't an army, it was a mob. But Goebbels, desperate to keep the dream alive, went on the radio and promised the world an unbreakable wall of steel. In reality, the Volkssturm bled out faster than anyone could have imagined. By March 1945, as American tanks stormed across the Rhine and Soviet artillery pounded Berlin, the Volkssturm was little more than a ghost army. Boys stabbed at shadows, old men fired blindly into the haze. Children dug trenches with spoons while shells tore the city apart. Rats gnawed on frozen bodies in the streets. Inside Hitler's bunker, the truth was impossible to ignore. His so-called People's Army wasn't stopping the enemy. It was falling apart from the inside. Reports of mass desertions, mutinies, looting, they piled up faster than he could read them. What he had created wasn't a shield, it was a suicide pact. By May 2nd, Berlin was finished. Hitler was gone, and the soldiers he had once hesitated to arm, the Blue Division, the Volkssturm, were buried under the ruins they had helped create. In the end, it wasn't lack of weapons that doomed Hitler. It wasn't even the strength of the enemy. It was the chaos he unleashed inside his own empire, a chaos even he couldn't control. So in the end, the soldiers Hitler was afraid to arm were more than just fighters. They were a reminder that even the fiercest loyalty can't tame chaos. If you're interested in more fascinating history content, make sure to click on the next video.